this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to fix a miscrossed cable without having to rip out all the stitches. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. What I have here is a swatch with cable crossings, and you'll see one of the cable crossings was done in the wrong direction. These were all done to the left up here, but for one of them I miscrossed the cable. So rather than pulling my needle out of all of the stitches and then ripping all the way back to before that cable crossing point, I'm only going to ladder down the span of stitches that are involved in the mistake, and that's the 6 stitches that are involved in this cable. This technique can be used at any point after you've discovered the error. You don't have to do it within a row or two at all. What you need to do first is work across the row just as you would normally until you get to the stitches in the cable. So here you can see I've made it all the way across, and it's these 6 stitches in the center that are the problem. So everything else is going to stay on the needles. Only the 6 stitches that are a problem are going to be laddered down. Now, if this terrifies you, you can create essentially a lifeline across those stitches if you like. So this is the cable crossing that's a problem. So a row or two below that crossing, I can insert a thin double-pointed needle across the stitches. So if you look at the cable crossing, we can see that here's where the cables cross. This is where a stitch from the center crossed over the top. So the row below that would have all been worked completely across, and depending on what gauge you're working at and how tightly you're knitting the stitches, you may or may not be able to get a needle through the row right below the crossing. You might have to go another row below, but I'm going to do it through the row below if I can. So I'm going to bring my needle up, come up through the center of the stitch, so you see I have the right leg of the stitch on the needle, and then I go down between the stitches and I catch the right leg. Each stitch looks like a V, so I'm coming up through the center of the V, and then I'm getting this one. And when you get to the center where the crossing occurs, you might need to pull the stitches across. Now I'm coming under stitch number 4, stitch number 5, and then the final one, stitch number 6. So this way I know that if I rip back and I'm losing stitches, nothing is going to go past here. I'm not going to rip back any further than this. So this is one row more than what I need to take out, but at least I won't be taking even more out when I don't want to. Now I should say I never do this. I don't worry about it, but if you're worried about it, that's something that you can do. So now we're going to take these stitches off the needle. And I'm going to start ripping back. Now, if you've worked a few cable crossings, one or more cable crossings since the miscrossed cable, you're going to want, well, I find it easier anyway, to keep these in groups together. So what I have here is one wrong side row and then the crossing row. So I did a crossing row and then I worked a wrong side row. So I need to take out 2 rows to release the previous crossing row. You can see when you've released a crossing row, because these are still crossed. I'm just bringing a needle up in between stitches and pulling it out, and now you can see that these have uncrossed. So what I know here is that these 2 long strands that had been used to knit those 2 rows, those 2 belong to the lower one is the crossing row, and the one above it is just the wrong side row. I'm going to group these 2 together. I'm going to link them together using a locking stitch marker so that I know that when I get to this bottom rung that is a crossing row. Now I can start ripping out all of these rows. So once again, I'm just going to put my double point under there and rip these out as I go. It's 2, 3, getting close to the crossing row. That's number 9. And so we've got one more that will be the actual crossing row. That's this one. These stitches are all above the needle. If I can capture those, I want to. This is the crossing row. So I should have a group of 10 strands here that represent that whole repeat of the cable crossing. So once again, I'm going to link all these together. And now, if I think I can, I'm going to try to just grab these. I don't really need this needle, but if you feel like you need it, you can leave it in there. Now I'm just going to get them on any way I can. I don't care so much about if I'm splitting a stitch or if it's sitting on the needle incorrectly. I'm just trying to capture them. So I have all 6 stitches. I'm going to take out this lifeline because I don't need it. So I have all 6 stitches. I want to make sure they're all sitting on the needle correctly. So I'm just going to slip them from one needle to another just to make sure that I have the right leg, the leading leg of the stitch is hanging over the front, and I just want to make sure that they're all doing that. So these all look good. This one looks good. This one is split and it's sitting on the needle funny. So I want to just rearrange it so that I have all of the plies on the needle and it's the right leg is hanging over the needle. And then this last one isn't split, but it's sitting with the right leg over the back of the needle. You see how the leg that's closest to the tip is over the back of the needle? That's the leading leg. That's the right leg of the stitch. I want that one hanging over the front of my needle so that it's seated right, seated correctly for when I knit it. So this group of ladders are all associated with a repeat. And remember, the first one is the crossing row. So these are the stitches that need to be crossed. So what I like to do is I like to cross the stitches ahead of time, just reorder the stitches. So we want them to be crossed to the left. So it's these double pointed needles are very handy. So I'm going to take 3 stitches, that's the half, and now I want to look at which way are they supposed to cross. If they're supposed to cross to the left, that means these stitches on this needle are going to be coming across the front. So I'm just going to reorder these stitches. So I want these to cross to the left. So I just cross them over there and then I slip these stitches in the front. I just put them on the other needle. So these are crossed and they're ready to be worked. Now what I can do is look for the lowest rung of the ladder. So I want to make sure I have the lowest rung here, and then I can reclip these together so that they're out of the way. What I want to make sure doesn't happen is I don't want any of these loose strands to get lost and hang down the back and not get used when I'm re-knitting out. So I want to make sure I'm using the correct rung, and I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally losing any. So I'm going to use this rung to re-knit these stitches. And I'm using double pointed needles that are a little bit smaller than the needles I used. This is a bulky weight yarn and I used a size 10 needle to knit these cables, and I've got some size 8 needles that I'm going to use. And the reason I like to go a little bit smaller is because you have this limited amount of yarn. You don't have the ball of yarn off to the side that allows you to manipulate it. If you're not used to working continental, that's fine, but you can learn to do it just for the purposes of re-knitting these cables. So you're going to knit this, you're going to insert through the front, and you're going to reach around. If you're a continental knitter, you already know how to do this. You're going to reach around from the back so that the yarn is hanging over the top, and then you're going to pull it through. If you need to put your finger on there to anchor it while you pull it through, you can do that. You could also use a crochet hook instead and load all of these onto a crochet hook, coming around from behind and pulling it through. So you're going to knit across all of these stitches. It's hard to do this English style because with English you want the yarn, the yarn is held over here and you run out of yarn after a while. You can do it for a little bit, but then you start to run out of slack once you get to the end. So you might be able to do it for most of the stitches and then not all of them. But because you're using a smaller needle, you have a little more slack. So on that last one, you can just let this yarn hang over the left-hand needle, and then you can pull the last stitch over like that if you need to, if you're running out of slack. So I have quite a bit of slack here, and these stitches are a little tighter than they need to be. I can pull some of that slack out now and redistribute it, or I can wait until the end. So again, I find the lowest rung, pull that one out, and clip the other ones together. So at this point, I have worked myself all the way up to this grouping where I needed to do another crossing. And you can see how sloppy this last stitch is because there was more slack in it and I was using smaller needles. So what I always do is I manually adjust the stitch size across the fabric. You can do this as you knit up each row, or you can do it at the end, depending on your preference. So once again, I'm ready for a crossing row. So I've crossed the stitches and now I'm going to knit them. So I'm using a needle 2 sizes smaller. If I'd used one size smaller, I wouldn't have as much slack. So the other thing I could do to counteract the amount of readjusting is to deliberately knit looser as I go across the row. Sometimes this can backfire and you can run out, but you can always adjust however you want. And again, I'm down to this last stitch. I can treat this sort of like a yarn over, lifting it up like that, then pulling the final stitch over it if I need to. That's really handy if you really run out of slack. These don't need quite as much adjusting because I was knitting with a looser tension as I was knitting across. So now I've completed the fix of the cable crossings and I can continue on. I can just leave these on this needle and knit them right off of this needle if I want to. And then put it to the side. And then continue on. Laddering down to fix errors is the technique I use more than any other for fixing mistakes. Using it to correct cable errors may seem scary at first, but it saves so much time over ripping back entire rows or rounds. In addition, you avoid introducing new errors into the project because you don't need to reknit sections that were perfectly fine before. Practicing on a swatch with or without a lifeline double-pointed needle may help you feel more confident when you attempt this on a real project. If you find my technique videos helpful, you can show your appreciation by buying me a coffee on Ko-fi.com. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.